Thanks so much for joining me for another edition of Parker Biology. Today we're going to be examining the endocrine system. Remember, we're looking at systems as they relate to cellular processes. So within cellular communication, we've examined the nervous system, and today we'll look at another type of system involved with communication, that being the endocrine system. While the nervous system was all about rapid control using electrical impulses, the endocrine system is a much slower control, and this is also going to help coordinate and direct activity of body cells. Remember back to our discussion of the types of cell signaling? We had autocrine signaling, where a cell could talk to itself. We had juxtacrine signaling, where a cell could talk to a touching cell. We had paracrine signaling, where a cell could talk to a nearby cell. And then there was endocrine signaling. The endocrine system does utilize endocrine signaling, where the cells that are talking are farther away. And given this, the endocrine system requires chemical messengers secreted by cells into extracellular fluids. And these chemical messengers are known as hormones. So when we hear anything about hormones, we should automatically start thinking about the endocrine system. While most people probably think about reproduction as being a major process regulated by hormones, there are a number of other functions that hormones can play, such as regulation of growth and development, namely growth hormone helps with this, defenses against stressors, maintaining water, nutrient, and electrolyte balance, specifically antidiuretic hormone can help with water maintenance, and energy balance, as we'll see a little bit later with glucagon and insulin. Remember that the nervous system is the other major system involved with communication and control, but here we're just looking at a slightly slower control. Endocrine glands are characterized as secreting hormones directly into surrounding fluid, so we can also describe these as being ductless. There are some other glands that we're not going to look at specifically here, but they're known as exocrine glands, and those are glands that do have ducts, for example, sweat glands. We're going to focus here, though, on the ductless, or the endocrine glands. So we've got hormones oozing directly into extracellular fluid, traveling through the blood supply. And you'll notice in this diagram that there are bits and pieces of the endocrine system tucked away in widely separated regions of the body, which is why when we say they talk to each other, we're saying they travel larger distances. It's important to note that only certain cells are affected by each hormone, and we refer to these cells that can hear the hormonal messages as target cells. Why is that? Why don't all hormones affect all cells? Well, this comes back to the basis of cellular communication, that the hormone or the signaling molecule or ligand needs to bind specifically with the target cell. And the portion where it binds, remember, is the receptor region. And this needs to be highly specific, where the shape of the hormone and the shape of the receptor are complementary. Remember in our introduction to cell communication, we talked about the idea that some ligands bind to the plasma membrane, whereas some ligands are able to get through the plasma membrane and have an intracellular receptor. So when we talk about the lipid-soluble hormones, we can also describe these as being steroidal. Remember back to organic molecules, we said that steroids are an example of a lipid. They are not soluble in water, and that means that they do have an easy time getting through the phospholipid bilayer. They do not have a problem with those lipid tails. So they can gain access to the cell, they can bind to DNA, and they can function in gene regulation. Which of these diagrams do you think best tells the story of a steroidal hormone? Very good. If we look at the picture on the right, we can see that that hormone is getting to enter the cell. It's moving through the blood, entering the cell, and its receptor lies within the nucleus. Non-steroidal hormones, on the other hand, are water soluble, and that means they're going to have a harder time getting through the plasma membrane. So it makes sense that instead of having a receptor inside the nucleus, like the steroidal hormones did, that their receptor would be on the plasma membrane. Here we can see non-steroidal hormones being released via exocytosis, traveling through the blood, and binding to that receptor on the plasma membrane. From there, we'll see transduction and response. A great example of a non-steroidal hormone at work is epinephrine. Think back to Sutherland's experiments. Remember that the cell did require an intact membrane in order to hear the message of epinephrine. And remember, the ultimate goal of epinephrine was to bring about activation of glycogen phosphorylase to promote the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, for instance, in a fight or flight response. So here we see the signaling molecule coming in and binding to the receptor. This is a G protein coupled receptor, so binding of the epinephrine brings about changes, allowing the G protein to become activated. As it becomes activated, it's going to slide across the membrane, in turn activating another enzyme, which brings about the help of a non-protein second messenger, cyclic AMP, who then goes on to activate protein kinase, eventually bringing about the breakdown of glycogen. So we've got reception, we've got transduction, and ultimately some sort of cellular response. Please go ahead and pause this video and take a minute to describe what you see in that pathway. Be sure to include the three main components of cell communication: reception, transduction, and response. So how do cells know if they should or should not release hormones? Well, most of our systems are regulated via negative feedback mechanisms. And when we say negative feedback mechanisms, this doesn't mean it's a bad thing. In fact, it's a vital thing. What negative feedback mechanisms do is they help bring body conditions back to normal. For example, if you think about how the air conditioner works, it's running and the room gets too cold. Once it reaches that certain critical temperature, the AC shuts off. However, if it starts to get too warm again, the air conditioner kicks back on. So ultimately, it's trying to maintain this ideal internal condition, not too hot, not too cold. Likewise, in the body, when there's too much of a certain hormone present, it tells the endocrine gland to stop making so much of that hormone. Once the hormone levels start to drop, the gland will start making it again. And again, this is mostly how our body systems are regulated. I'm going to summarize negative feedback mechanisms as bringing conditions back to normal. The opposite of a negative feedback mechanism is known as a positive feedback mechanism. And again, this does not mean that it's a good thing. It just means that it's going to push conditions further from normal. What do I mean by that? What's a situation where we'd see things pushed away from normal? Well, one great example of this is blood clotting. It's not normal for your blood to be solid. However, if you have an injury, platelets collect and a clot needs to form to keep you from bleeding to death. So when platelets start to collect and more platelets collect and the blood becomes more and more solid, that's pushing away from the normal liquid form of blood. Another great example is childbirth and labor. It's not normal for the uterus to contract violently. However, as the fetus's head is pushing on the cervix, that causes a release of hormones that cause the uterus to contract. And the more it contracts, and the more the baby's head pushes against the cervix, the stronger the contractions get. again pushing away from a normal relaxed state of the uterus. And while these instances are certainly helpful for our survival and the survival of our species, it's the negative feedback mechanisms that are typically involved with our endocrine control. Here we're going to look at how insulin and glucagon help us maintain ideal blood glucose levels. Remember, glucose is vital in terms of an energy source, and it's really important that we keep our glucose within an ideal range. Small fluctuations are okay, but if we have too much glucose in our blood, we could go into a coma. And if we have too little glucose in our blood, we could also have seizures, go into a coma, or die. So it's really important that we do have these hormones to help keep us in this ideal range or homeostasis. Would you say this is a better example of positive or negative feedback? Very good. This is negative feedback because these hormones are going to help bring the blood glucose levels back towards normal. Positive would push it further from normal, and we sure don't want our blood glucose levels pushed out of the ideal range. Your job now is to look through the hormonal control of glucose and see how glucagon and insulin are going to interact to help make sure glucose stays in an ideal range. You'll also want to examine the feedback control, especially remembering that glycogen is the storage polymer of glucose. And finally, you'll glance at another example of antagonistic hormones, or hormones that work against each other in order to bring about balance, in this case, regulating blood calcium levels. And this will be calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Do the best you can, work through these diagrams, and there will be an answer key posted to the hub. Bring any questions you've got to next class. Thanks so much for joining me for the Endocrine System edition of Parker Biology.